I was, many years ago, once a member of the choir at the parish I was attending. So I was sitting over here, except we were up in the choir loft in that church that I was singing in. It was back in my college days, so Potsdam, New York, and I remember very clearly Monsignor Acoin, who was the pastor there, getting up and giving a homily on this weekend. And it was one of those homilies that stuck out to me because it was something that made so much sense and yet had never kind of penetrated my thought process before. In that gospel we just heard, the Sadducees coming to Jesus and kind of giving him this situation about the brothers and the wife of the first brother. And when you dig into kind of the things behind this gospel reading, and Jesus just puts it out there, it doesn't matter when you're in heaven. The realities of this world are not the realities of heaven. Yes, we are married here in this life. And those relationships remain even in heaven. But the saints don't go on. It's not one of those things where, we're in a new life now, okay. There's not saints getting married in heaven to each other. That's just not the reality of what God has created and what happens there. And that coming age, it's hard sometimes for us to think about these things, about heaven and the resurrection of the body, because they're things that we have no experience of. They're theological, theoretical in some ways. So the fancy, $10 billion word in theology when we talk about the last things is eschatology. Eschatology. And it's really the last things, not the last things, but we're talking about the end times. We're talking about the end of our own life and what comes after death on this earth. And it kind of all comes together. The church has some wisdom in the way she puts together the liturgical calendar and why she chooses the readings that we hear each weekend. So we just celebrated All Saints' Day, talking about heavenly things. And we just celebrated All Souls' Day, all those faithful departed. And we in the church remember and pray in a special way for all the dead during the month of November, remembering our own loved ones, our friends, all of those who have gone before us in faith. And so it also makes sense that our readings on Sundays during the end of this time, that always happens in November, kind of point towards these things as well. These things of death. And it's not easy to think or talk about death. I think when we bring it up, it brings up all sorts of feelings, things of grief, mourning, funerals that we've been to, fear sometimes about diseases or growing older. It's all a part of that. And we're, as Christians, not called to be afraid of death, though many people are. Many people are. And that's a reality. But why do we get afraid? I think because in some ways we're focused so much on this world and this life, and not of those things which are to come. So if we dive into this more, this gospel, all these readings that we've heard talk about this idea of resurrection. We say it, we believe it, that our bodies will be resurrected when Jesus comes again and brings about that new world, new creation. It's something that for many of us seems very, very distant. Well, who knows when Jesus will come again? And yet we prepare for that. We long for it. Who knows when that time of the resurrection of the dead will come about? And there's all sorts of questions that get thrown around. In fact, I had a middle schooler come up to me and was asking me questions about this earlier in the week. And I thought to myself, well, maybe she's reading the Sunday readings. Very good things. That understanding that what Jesus has begun in rising from the dead and being resurrected and having the glorified body, the firstborn of the dead, as we call him, as we just heard in that gospel canticle, the antiphon there. Jesus Christ is the firstborn of the dead. To him be glory and power forever and ever. So too, we await that for ourselves. Just as we await coming to see God in heaven in a greater way, a full presence before him, not just a conversation of prayer, but being in his presence in heaven. So too, we long for that day when God will bring about that glorification of our own bodies, that glorification, that resurrection, a reunification of our souls, the souls of our departed brothers and sisters with their bodies. It's okay. You don't have to understand it fully. You don't have to get all mixed up in the science and this, that, the other thing. It's okay. But it is something that we believe, and that's why we hear about it in the Scriptures, and it is something that is a part of the reality of our faith. Now, just as this, these realities and understandings of our faith, these things that we believe, these things that we go about, so we're all obsessed with life. We love living, I think. We try and sustain our lives. We try and keep healthy to be able to flourish in our lives. That hope of the resurrection from the dead, the care for our bodies and our spirits. And yet that can be difficult when we're going about the realities of our lives, and there's so many things that begin to distract us. And it can be difficult because we sometimes can't sit down to think about, well, maybe I really don't want to think or pray about the end of my life because I'm just trying to get through the living right now. But the reality is, if we don't think about these things, what happens when we come to the end? Are we prepared? Are we prepared for that reality of we're going to God? Or that judgment that comes for each and every one of us? Flipping to talking about our first reading, that understanding this beautiful story from the book of Maccabees, the second book, a difficult time in Jewish history of the nation of Israel. Their faith was being crushed. The rulers, the government of that time, Antiochus IV was the name of the king, wanted to completely suppress any faith that was not Hellenized Greek paganism, as we would call it today. And the story of these brothers and their mother, we don't hear from her mother, but there's beautiful passages, her building up her sons and saying, do this, die for the faith that I have taught you, that your father has taught you. Die for it. Because I believe that if you die for it, I will see you again. And we will rejoice before God for having been the ones who kept to the faith. An interesting idea that one way to live is to die. To die to self, to die to so many things, but not to their faith. To live in that faith and live it to the greatest end of it. How many saints gave up their lives because of what they believed in? How many people stand up and say, I believe in this? And though people attack them, though people will kill them for it even, both in a way of killing the body, but also attacking them and attempting to kill them, to bring them down, to root them out. and yet they will remain steadfast to that faith. This is not a new concept for us. We hear about it all the time with the martyrs. We hear about it. But how many of us truly do live out that faith? Or are we willing to say, Are we willing to say, okay? All these issues that come up, the hot button issues, they're issues that we have reason and faith. When we talk about abortion, when we talk about euthanasia, when we talk about health issues, when we talk about same-sex marriage, all these different things, the hot button issues, do we go first and look to our faith? Do we allow our faith to inform us and what we are to believe? Or do we go somewhere else for that information and for that foundation? Because it's easier? How can we set aside our faith? How can we set those things aside? Because they are the things of life. We know them to give us life. And there's a difference between love and tolerance. Love sometimes is tough. But that willingness for a person to say to a brother or sister, no, you really need to not do that. That is love. And sometimes we have to love in a tough and difficult way. And sometimes that love even leads to a death in some ways. What I'm saying here is that we live in a world, we live in a culture that in some ways is obsessed with life, but at the same time is killing itself. How can you want to support life? How can you want to be so I'd say even distracted sometimes by trying to care for the body, for people, and yet at the same time be willing to kill an unborn child or snuff out the life of someone who probably really needs help to live? How can we stand up for this? In a culture that attacks so many people, that roots out and causes so many people to not be able to feel that they can live, that they're loved. Brothers and sisters, God is a God of the living. The living, and He wants to give us life. He wants us to flourish in this life and be with Him in the life of heaven. We have to make sure that we are standing by our faith. I think all of us here probably can say we want to go to heaven. We want to be with God. And the truth is that we have to be willing to suffer and live out that faith truly, because the glory and the greatness and the joy of heaven are worth it. We have to contemplate these things. We have to be willing to stand up for what we believe. Those baptismal promises that we made, that others made for us, and that we take on and renew every year. Do you reject Satan? Do you reject all his empty promises? Do you believe in God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit? Do you believe in one holy Catholic Apostolic Church? Do you believe in the communion of saints, the resurrection of the dead, and the life of the world to come? And with that comes every other aspect and teaching of our faith and of our church. Cafeteria Catholic, as we would call it, has no place in a life of faith. We can't pick and choose. And those Catholics who blatantly go out there and support things that are against their faith, we have to pray for them. Because there are brothers and sisters and they have lost their way. So my brothers and sisters, what we need to walk away with today, I think, is a commitment to looking at ourselves, looking at what we believe, and looking to those things of heaven, and remembering what God would have us do because we are men and women of faith. Being willing to endure the sufferings of this world, the ridicule, whatever it is, because we know the greatness and the joy and the hope of what is to come for us in eternal life.